envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from the hardware store, and I knew before I even opened it that something was wrong. It had my daughter's return address on it, but the handwriting on the inside, the signature at the bottom of the legal document folded in thirds, that wasn't her handwriting. It was mine. Or rather, it was supposed to be mine. Someone had signed my name to a power of attorney document giving my daughter full control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. I sat down at that table and read it 3 times. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee, went out to the back porch, and listened to the birds for a while. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there and thought about how I'd gotten here. My name is Dale, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant outside Columbus, Ohio. I retired early, not because I wanted to, but because the plant downsized and my knees weren't what they used to be. I have a modest house I paid off in 2019, a pickup truck, a small savings account, and a pension that covers my basic needs if I'm careful. I'm not a wealthy man, but I am not a fool either. My daughter Stephanie is 34. She married a man named Pierce about 4 years ago. Pierce came from money, or so he wanted everyone to believe. He had the vocabulary for it: portfolio, leverage, passive income. But from what I could see, most of what he had was debt dressed up in nice clothes. He drove a leased BMW. They rented a townhouse in a suburb that was a little too expensive for what they earned. He worked in commercial real estate, which means some months were fine and some months were not fine at all. Stephanie was always my soft spot. Her mother passed when Stephanie was 16, and it was just the 2 of us for a long time after that. I worked overtime so she could go to a good college. I helped her with her first car, her first apartment deposit, her student loans when she fell behind. When she married Pierce, I gave them $12,000 as a wedding gift, money I'd been setting aside for years in a separate account I thought of as the just-in-case fund. I thought that was what fathers did. I still think that. The giving wasn't the problem. The problem was what came after. About 8 months after the wedding, Pierce started calling me more often. Not to chat. Pierce never called to chat, but to ask questions. What was my mortgage situation? Had I thought about a reverse mortgage? Did I have a will? Was I working with a financial advisor? I answered his questions the way you answer questions from someone you're still trying to like, honestly, but briefly. Then the visit started. He and Stephanie would come over on Sundays, and Pierce would walk around my house the way a contractor walks through a property he's thinking about buying. He'd comment on the square footage, mention what similar homes in my neighborhood had sold for recently, ask if I'd ever thought about downsizing. Stephanie just smiled and said he was curious. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Then about 6 months ago, Stephanie sat me down at this same kitchen table and told me she was worried about me. She said she'd been talking to Pierce, and they both felt I wasn't managing well on my own. I was 62 at the time. I walked 2 miles every morning. I cooked my own meals. I handled my own finances. I drove myself everywhere. I had a doctor I saw twice a year, and my blood work was fine. She said she thought it might be time to think about transitioning to a supported living situation. I asked her what that meant. She said there was a very nice assisted living community called Meadow Glen about 20 minutes away. She'd toured it already. I remember the silence in that kitchen, the refrigerator hum, a car going by outside. I said, "Stephanie, I'm 62. She said she knew that, but that it was important to plan ahead. I said I had planned ahead. I had a pension, a paid-off house, and savings. I was fine. She said that Pierce thought, and here she paused like she was choosing her words carefully, that it might make more sense for me to liquidate some of my assets now, while I was still sharp enough to make good decisions, and move somewhere that could provide more support over time. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Who would manage those liquidated assets?" She didn't answer right away. I said I needed to get some rest, and walked them to the door. That night I called my buddy Gordon. We've known each other since high school. He's a retired police detective, and I told him what had happened. He didn't say much. He just said, "Dale, document everything from here forward. Write down dates, conversations, everything, and don't sign anything. I started doing exactly that. Over the next 3 months, the pattern became clear. Pierce would plant an idea. I wasn't managing well. I needed help. Things would be easier if Stephanie had access to help me. Then Stephanie would come over and reinforce it. Then both of them would arrive together and present something, a brochure, a form, a suggestion that I just let Stephanie handle my bills because it was one less thing to worry about. I kept saying no. I stayed calm about it. I didn't want to believe what I was starting to believe, which was that my daughter and her husband were methodically trying to take control of everything I had. Then the envelope arrived. I sat on that porch for a long time. Then I went back inside, took out a pad of paper, and wrote down every single thing I could remember. Every conversation, every visit, every document they'd shown me, every subtle comment Pierce had made about my cognitive health. I had dates for most of it because Gordon had told me to keep that journal. Then I called an elder law attorney. Her name was Miss Fairfield, and her office was about 40 minutes from my house. I found her through the Ohio State Bar's referral service, specifically looking for someone who handled elder financial abuse cases. I drove there the following Tuesday and sat across from her for 90 minutes. She looked at the power of attorney document and said two things immediately. First, it was fraudulent. My signature had been forged, and she could tell because it didn't match the signature on my driver's license, which I'd brought along. Second, forging a power of attorney is a felony in Ohio under the criminal code for forgery and identity fraud. She asked me if I wanted to pursue it. I said I wanted to know all my options first. She said I could file a report with the local police, contact the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Justice Unit, report the fraud to my bank, which had a legal obligation to flag suspicious account activity, and pursue a civil remedy. She also said that in the meantime I should not confront Stephanie or Pierce, should not let them know I had the document, and should immediately add protections to my financial accounts. I followed all of it. I called my bank that same afternoon and spoke with the branch manager directly. I'd banked there for over 20 years. I explained the situation, showed him a photo of the document, and asked him to flag my accounts for any unusual activity or any attempt by a third party to claim authority over them. He took it seriously. He escalated it to their fraud team within the hour. The fraud team called me back the next morning. They told me there had already been an inquiry, not a successful one, but an inquiry from someone attempting to set up a secondary access link to my checking account. The inquiry had been denied because it didn't clear their verification protocols, but it had happened. I thanked them, hung up, and sat very still for a minute. Then I called Miss Fairfield back and told her. She said it was time to file. I filed a police report that same week. The detective I spoke with, a woman who handled financial crimes, took a full statement, photographed the document, and told me they would begin an investigation. She also recommended I contact Ohio's Adult Protective Services, which investigates elder abuse, including financial exploitation. I did that too, and then I waited. And while I waited, I saw my daughter. She called me about 2 weeks after I'd gotten the envelope, acting as if nothing had happened. She wanted to come over Sunday, she said. Bring brunch. Could she and Pierce stop by? I said yes. I also called Gordon the night before and asked him to teach me how to use the voice recorder on my phone. He spent an hour on the phone walking me through it. I practiced until I could start it with my phone still in my shirt pocket. They arrived at 10:30. Pierce brought pastries from a bakery downtown, the expensive kind, which meant he wanted something. We sat at the kitchen table. We made small talk about the weather and their neighborhood and some home improvement project they were thinking about. Then Pierce set his coffee cup down and said he'd been thinking about our previous conversations, and he felt like maybe they hadn't approached things the right way. He wanted to start fresh. He had a new proposal he thought I'd really like. I said, "Tell me about it." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a document, a different one this time, describing a family trust arrangement in which I would transfer my property and savings into a trust managed jointly by Stephanie and Pierce, with me listed as the beneficiary. He explained it would protect my assets from probate, simplify things down the road, make sure Stephanie could take care of me if anything happened. I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. I said, "Pierce, when did you try to access my checking account?" He blinked. Stephanie looked at her coffee. I said, "My bank flagged an inquiry. Someone tried to set up third-party access to my account. That was before this conversation, before this proposal. So I'm curious, what exactly is the plan here?" Pierce said I was confused, that wasn't what happened, that I must have misunderstood something. I reached into my shirt pocket and set my phone on the table. I said the recorder had been running since they walked in. I said I also had a copy of the power of attorney document they'd mailed me, the one with my forged signature. Stephanie made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Pierce started to say something about how I was making assumptions and there were explanations for everything. I said I didn't need his explanations. I told them both very quietly that I had already spoken to an attorney, that I had already filed a police report, that the document had been flagged as fraudulent, and that the bank inquiry was part of the same investigation. I told them that the detective on the case had my full statement and copies of everything. Then I said, "I want you both to leave my house." Pierce stood up and tried one more time. He said I was making a serious mistake, that they were only trying to help me, that I was going to regret this. I walked to the front door and held it open. After they left, I stood in my living room for a while. It was very quiet. I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I thought about Stephanie at age 12, learning to ride a bike in this same neighborhood. I thought about her at 16, sitting across from me in a hospital cafeteria while we waited for news about her mother. I thought about how much of myself I had poured into making sure she had a good life. I won't pretend that wasn't painful. It was the hardest part of all of it. But I also knew that what had been done to me, the forged document, the account inquiry, the months of slow pressure to hand over control, that wasn't love. That was something else entirely. The police investigation took about 10 weeks. I cooperated fully throughout. Pierce, as it turned out, had a previous civil judgment against him in Indiana from a business dispute, something that had never come up before. The forged power of attorney was traced back through document metadata and handwriting analysis. Stephanie, when questioned, told detectives that Pierce had handled the paperwork, and she hadn't reviewed it carefully. I don't know how much of that I believe. I'm not sure it matters. Pierce was charged with forgery, attempted financial exploitation of an older adult, and one count related to the fraudulent bank inquiry. Those charges were filed. What happens in court from here is up to the prosecutors and eventually a jury. My attorney says the case is straightforward. Stephanie was not charged, though she remains a person of interest in the investigation. She called me once after the charges were filed. She cried. She said Pierce had told her it was all legal, that she hadn't understood what she was signing, that she missed me and was sorry. I listened. I didn't say much. I told her I hoped she was telling the truth. I told her that when the legal process was complete, I would be open to a conversation. But that conversation would happen on my terms, with my attorney present, and it would require honesty from her that she had not shown me so far. She said that was fair. I said I'd be in touch when I was ready. I changed my locks that week. I updated my actual will with Ms. Fairfield, spelling out clearly that any person who challenges my mental competency without documented medical evidence would be removed from all beneficiary designations entirely. I added a trusted contact to my bank account, not Stephanie, but Gordon, who has known me for 45 years and has no financial interest in my estate. And I wrote a letter to Meadow Glen Assisted Living, explaining that I was a healthy 63-year-old man who had been referred there without his knowledge or consent, and that they should remove any file or inquiry associated with my name. They sent a polite letter back saying they had no record of an inquiry, which told me Pierce had either used a different name or it hadn't gotten that far yet. I framed that letter and hung it in my kitchen, which I know sounds strange, but I look at it sometimes when I'm making coffee in the morning, and it reminds me of something important. They miscalculated. They looked at a retired machinist who'd spent his whole life working with his hands, and they assumed he was an easy mark. They figured grief and loneliness had softened me into something they could manage. They were wrong about that. I am 63 years old. I walk 2 miles every morning. I cook my own meals. I balance my own accounts. I understand compound interest, contract law, and the difference between a standard power of attorney and a durable one. I looked all of that up in the months before any of this happened, because I've always believed in knowing the rules before someone tries to use them against you. I've been thinking about what I would say to other people my age who might be watching this. People whose kids have started asking strange questions about finances, or who feel a uncomfortable pressure from someone close to them to simplify their affairs or plan ahead before they feel like they need to. Here's what I'd say. Trust that feeling. That low, uncomfortable pressure. Trust it. You are allowed to ask who benefits. You are allowed to say no and keep saying no. You are allowed to get a lawyer before you sign anything, and you are allowed to record conversations in a state where only one party's consent is required, and Ohio is one of them. Know your state's laws, and know this: 63 is not old. 63 is not old. 63 is not diminished. 63 is a man who spent 3 decades building something from nothing, who raised a daughter through grief, who paid off a house, who sat on a porch and thought clearly about what to do next. They wanted to manage me. I managed myself just fine. The hardest loss in all of this isn't the money they almost took, or the legal fees, or the Sunday mornings I won't spend at that kitchen table with my daughter for a while. The hardest loss is the version of her I thought I knew. The girl who used to sit in the driveway with me and look at the stars and ask me questions I didn't always know how to answer. I don't know if that version of her is gone or just buried under a few years of a man who was wrong for her. I'm still her father. I'm still here. But I'm also the man who walked to the front door and held it open. And I'd do it again. I keep coming back to the moment I sat on that back porch holding a document with my own name forged at the bottom. The birds were doing what birds do. The neighbor's dog was barking at something. The world hadn't changed at all. Only what I knew about my own family had. What strikes me now, looking back at all of it, is how much Pierce counted on one thing: that I would not act. He had mapped out a version of me in his head, a tired, lonely man past his useful years. Someone who would feel guilty about making trouble for his own daughter. He needed that version of me to be real in order for any of it to work. And for a while, maybe I almost let it be. That's the part I think about most. Not the forged signature, not the fraudulent bank inquiry, not the brochure for Meadow Glen sitting on my kitchen table like a verdict someone had already decided. The part I think about is the months before any of that, when I told myself I was being uncharitable, when I smoothed over the discomfort, because I wanted to believe the best about my daughter. Being good to people you love is right, but goodness without clear eyes is just another way of leaving yourself undefended. I'm not a man who talks much about wisdom or character. Those words always sounded like something on a motivational poster to me. But I do believe this. The way a person responds when they're being taken advantage of says everything about who they actually are. Pierce and Stephanie made their choice, and they made it deliberately, step by step, document by document. And I made mine, not in anger, not in panic, but carefully, methodically, the same way I spent 31 years doing a job that required precision. I documented. I asked questions. I found the right attorney. I protected my accounts before they could be touched. I recorded the conversation at my own kitchen table. None of that came from rage. It came from the same steadiness I learned on a factory floor, the understanding that when something is broken, you diagnose it clearly before you reach for a tool. What I want anyone watching this to take away isn't really about me or Stephanie or Pierce. It's about the difference between being passive and being patient. I wasn't passive. I was watching, thinking, and preparing long before they knew I was doing any of it. That's not revenge. That's just a person who refused to be erased. 63 years old, paid off house. 2 miles every morning. They looked at all of that and saw a problem to be managed. I looked at all of that and saw a life worth protecting. There's a consequence to every choice. Pierce and Stephanie chose to treat a person as a transaction, and now they're facing the legal weight of that choice. I chose to stay calm, gather evidence, and let the truth do what truth does when you give it the right conditions to work. I'm not standing here saying everything is fine. I lost something with my daughter that I don't know if I'll ever fully get back. That loss is real and it's heavy, but I still walk those 2 miles every morning, and I know exactly who I am at the end of them.